Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
All four officers involved in the death of George Floyd, an African-American man, have now been charged amid protests and his memorial. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Officer Derek Chauvin was seen in a cell phone video with his knee placed on Floyd's neck, has seen the count against him up to second-degree felony murder. 3 other officers have also been charged with abetting the crime. Meanwhile, a memorial was held this week for Floyd as protests continued across the country. So what does it mean for the nation? On the phone with us this morning is Amber Green, co-chair of Salisbury's Lynching Memorial Task Force and local activist. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what is your reaction to the fact that now all 4 officers have been charged with Derek Chauvin now up to second-degree felony murder?
To be frank, I'm still offended. I feel as though it should be a first-degree murder charge. We all saw the video. Even though the other officers have been charged, I think the haste of, actually pressing those charges is still upsetting. It did not happen quick enough. And so it's happening, but I think there's still a reason for outcry. I don't think there's a reason for the outcry to stop.
Do you think it's going to have an impact on the protests? Certainly the protests this week, protesters were certainly elated by the fact that these charges had been filed and that the one had been upped.
Yes, and I think protesters who are out there in reference for George Floyd are definitely happy that those charges are filed. I definitely think they feel as though they had an effort in that, and I think they did. I feel as though the noise that were made on the streets and on the front lines were what brought those charges to place. However, I feel as though the majority of the people that are out there, the majority that are people out there today and across the country, are out there more for not just for George Floyd, but for the entire injustice that the black community in America has been facing. The justice system is broken. The police force needs to be reformed. And I think that is the major outcry that you'll see with protesters and with everything that's happening across our country. Yes, George Floyd's murder on camera happening on Memorial Day shook us, but I think this is a larger outcry, and it's going to have a huger impact because I don't think it's going to stop. I think it's going to continue until justice and change truly happens.
Are you surprised at the reaction? That is that we've had so many protests and that there seems to be a very great diversity within the protests that we've seen.
I am surprised. I'm surprised because it hasn't happened sooner. I've always said before, I don't know if many people follow me on my Facebook, but I've said even locally, Wacomico is a ticking time bomb. And as you see locally, we have young people rising up every day. Every day since George Floyd's death, there has been protests in Salisbury. So there are young people in our country who are joining together, uniting in a global fight. This isn't just happening in the United States. I think that's what everyone needs to remind themselves, is that this is a global outcry for justice for Black Americans. And I'm not too surprised because I feel like this day was coming. This day has been on the rise since, our president was elected. And I think we're here now, and now it's time to think about next steps.
By the way, how much of an impact do you think the fact that we now have the ability to create images through cell phones to capture some of these incidents? It does seem as if that has played a role in people being able to see what's going on. It also reminds me, for instance, in the 1960s when people were able to see on their television sets what was going on in the South in terms of the protests and the discrimination that was taking place there during Jim Crow. We seem to see a similar phenomenon in the sense that the nation is now being able to actually physically see what's going on.
I think it's kind of like one of those bittersweet things. With the increase of technology and cell phones and everything, we've been able to expose a lot of the things that the Black community have been said has been happening to us. But people have been saying, oh, racism is gone. It's not here. Now with cell phone, now with social media, now with Facebook Live, we can now show you that it is here and alive and well. However, we also have the fact that human race have this thing where we glorify gore. And now we are repeating the cycle, repeatedly showing the murder of Black men, the murder of Black children. And I wonder myself, when the media gets a hold of these social media images and the media gets a hold of these cell phone footages, it makes it feel like we're back to lynching, because now everybody is at this lynching site. Everybody is watching the death of this man. And you have people who are crying, but then you do have people who are celebrating in this man's death. And so I get torn with the power of media. I studied media in school and college, and it's a powerful thing. It's an amazing tool. However, it can be very dangerous, because the trauma it puts into the Black youth and the Black community when they're repeatedly seeing themselves, their brothers, their neighbors, their coworkers getting murdered. Why are you surprised by rioting and looting? Why are you surprised when that is the constant 24-hour cycle? And so it's just like what Killer Mike has said at his press interview in Atlanta. CNN, this is karma. I'm glad that those kids just took down brick and mortar and not actually killed an innocent father like the police officer did. So when it comes to media, I'm really am torn. I love that power that it gives the people, but when the media and the people in power get a hold of it, it becomes modern day lynching, and it really does break my heart. After Ahmaud Arbery, I have not watched the George Floyd video. I can't watch it. The Ahmaud Arbery was the last video I think that I will be able to watch. I have a Black son. I can't watch it anymore. And so I can imagine how many other Black mothers who are watching the news constantly are feeling.
I wanted to ask you, by the way, about some of the violence that has accompanied these peaceful protests. Protests, of course, for the most part have been. But we have had some looting. We've had some also some arson involved. What do you make of that? Was that to be expected? And does that mar in any way, do you think, people's perception of this protest?
I think the same thing has been happening since the 60s and 70s. I listen to my elders. I listen to those who came before me, and their stories have not changed. They've always said that protests always start peaceful. Even back in the 90s, even when you think about the Rodney King riots, everything started as peaceful. But then there are individuals who infiltrate and who don't want peace anymore, who cannot stand for peace anymore, and they act out. And so in this case right now, I have to look at Washington, D.C. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and I'm looking at videos on social media, and I'm listening to young people on social media, and I'm seeing that they want a peaceful protest. However, there are people from outside of the city coming into the city causing the chaos, and they don't want that. So when we're out here protesting, and it's the same for allies and it's the same for people in groups, why are you out there? Why are you out there? What is your reason? Is it for peace or is it for disruption? Which one are you doing? You have to decide which one you're doing. Now, to those who are out there and their reason is for disruption, me as a Black woman, I cannot judge that Black man, that Black girl, that Black kid who has reached their boiling point and they are now acting out in disruptive ways. I can only hold them. I can only care for them. I cannot judge them. I may not agree, but I can understand where the anger and frustration comes from.
Let me ask you finally about leadership. First of all, obviously the president of the White House, but also the Democratic leadership, the political leadership, which is in opposition to the president, at least currently, Joe Biden, that kind of thing. What do you make of those two leaderships?
Honestly, I feel like we're in another situation of picking the lesser evils. I feel like we're repeating cycles again. But for me personally, I understand how horrible the current president has, made an impression on, citizens, how horribly he's represented this country, how horribly he's represented the servicemen who have serviced this country, my family included. He is an embarrassment, and I can proudly say that. I am embarrassed from my president. And because of that, I think, we have a duty to hold our elected officials accountable. If we don't want history to repeat themselves, then we have to hold who we want in office accountable. So if the majority wants the replacement of our current president to be Biden, then I want the majority to hold that president accountable. Make sure his policies are ensuring everyone is held safe. Make sure that he is protecting everyone in America. That's my only state, I guess, the statement with that. If you want someone in office, make sure that you hold them accountable, because we haven't held our current president accountable for nothing.
Finally, are you optimistic about change in this country as a result, obviously, of the reaction and the things that have taken place just within the last few weeks? But it does seem as if there are other changes with, say, Confederate memorials, for instance, having been taken down. I mean, there does seem to be something else going on in the country.
I definitely see change. The reason why I see change is speaking locally. I have not seen the amount of young people energized, activated, involved in the political realm and the social justice realm that I've seen in the past few years of being on the Eastern Shore. So that gives me hope. I was able to educate, the young people who are out there protesting about the local issues that are happening now in our current county. For example, Wacomico County is trying to push a 2A sanctuary for this area. A lot of people did not know that, and so I was able to educate those young people, and they know the dangers of a 2A sanctuary. They know that they don't want to be an Ahmaud Arbery. They don't want to be a George Floyd. So they are now going to take their energy that they have now and now focus on local issues, focus on this 2A sanctuary. And so I am so optimistic because now what has happened nationally has energized a network of organizers, of activists here on the Eastern Shore. And that brings joy to my heart because the Eastern Shore is the epicenter of Black history in this country. All of amazing Black liberation started on the Eastern Shore. And in my opinion, it is time for the Eastern Shore to take its place back in Black history. And I think that time is happening, and I am excited for it. And I can't wait.
Yes, we mentioned that the Second Amendment sanctuary effort that I understand will be largely symbolic, that it wouldn't have any real impact, but nonetheless it's there. Do you have any sense about whether or not that's going to pass as a resolution?
There is strong sense that the resolution is going to be passed with amendments. However, it is true that it is said that it has no real law effect. It is symbolic. That is true. And when people say that it's symbolic, I want them to focus on what it actually means as symbolic. When I say that it's symbolic, I mean if you declare our county a 2A sanctuary, you are basically signaling, symbolically saying, KKK, you are welcome here. Hate crime, you are welcome here. And that's the message that this resolution says to the Black community of Wicomico County. The Wicomico NAACP has spoken out against this two-way sanctuary numerous of times unto unheard, and no one has paid attention. Now there is a coalition that has been formed with local organizations and community members called Wicomico for Common Sense Gun Safety to help push out the voice of the NAACP and to help amplify those voices who do not want a two-way sanctuary. The county received over 200 plus letters from individuals in favor of this. And some of these individuals could be found on Facebook threatening the lives of protesters. So that's all that I can say. If they pass this two-way sanctuary, they are symbolically saying hate crime is welcome in Wicomico County.
Okay,
and that's a problem.
And of course, I'm sure that supporters of this other measure would probably say that's not true, but that's for another time and another discussion. We've been talking with Amber Green. She's co-chair of Salisbury's Lynching Memorial Task Force and local activist, and we'll be following that issue as it goes on. And Amber, I appreciate the fact that you've taken some time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And we'll be right back. We now turn to Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin to take a look at the politics of the recent events. Michael, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Don.
So first of all, what do you make of these latest events? We've obviously had a large number of protests across the country, mostly peaceful, some violence. But we've also, of course, seen the officers in the case also charged, including the upping of, against one officer, the count to second-degree felony murder, which was greeted with a good deal of gladness, as it were, by many of the protesters. What do you make of the politics of all of this?
I think one way to get a handle on this is to think of it as there are two narratives that are being driven. One by the Trump administration and the other by, in effect, the protesters, and which then have an impact on the Biden campaign. So I think if we take the Trump administration's position right now, it's really the reminiscent of the Nixonian law and order approach, and that is to use really the language of really an authoritarian language where they're talking about domestic terrorism, defining the idea that we're going to dominate the streets, and even Esper, Secretary of Defense, uses the language of we need to dominate the battle space, as if the whole issue is surrounded with again, the protesters being defined as domestic terrorists. And I think that part of the strategy is that I think they genuinely think they can quell the demonstrations, and then the political implication for them is that it's quite strong, and that is the hope that the Trump campaign really hopes then to rally the Trump base. Clearly, the going to the church with the Bible, holding the Bible in the hand, with an attempt to appeal to the evangelical base. And I think to a certain extent as well, perhaps the law and order language is a way to scare even those suburban voters to come back to the Republican fold. In dramatic contrast, I think the protesters, that the other narrative that's clearly being driven here is powerfully by the protest movement, is really one, of course, of social justice, and in particular racial justice. And the immediate focus, of course, is on the George Floyd case, justice for George Floyd. But of course, the broader issue is more systemic. The whole problem of police culture, the problem of the chokeholds, the problem of police brutality nationwide, and I think that's a very powerful part of what is being defined here. And I think politically, what I find most interesting at this point is that this is clearly driving the Biden campaign in a different direction. I mean, the recent reporting indicates that the Biden campaign really is moving to embrace more emphatically the whole notion of systemic racism. I mean, Biden himself has used this term systemic racism, moving beyond simply that this is an aberrant case, but instead there's more of a structural problem that we need to be facing. Additionally, we now hear Biden talking about himself as, in effect, the reaffirmation of FDR. We're now the whole idea that Biden could change from a transitional president to a transformational president. So I think the movement, the protest movement, not only has powered again the issue, of course, of racial justice, but also moving the Democratic nominee to the left, more broadly speaking. So we're not going to simply deal with the racial issue, but of course the economic issues, healthcare issues, and the like.
What do you think might be the impact, though, on the down ballot candidates? I know they saw a piece the other day which raised questions about a couple of Democratic seats that were in the area of Minneapolis that some are now concerned could be affected. They were generally safe seats, but that could be affected, particularly the suburban women who might just tip the balance against the Democratic candidate. Do you think there might be some down ballot impacts?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a risk, and this is, I think, the strategy from the Trump side, and that is to put the fear of God into the suburban voters, and if they can push in the Biden campaign, in effect, or Biden being pushed further to the left by this social movement that we're witnessing, and that does endanger some of those candidates, perhaps, but that's to be seen, whether or not those suburban voters who are, and again, we're really talking, I think, principally about suburban white educated women who in the 2018 midterms had drafted to the Democratic side. Can they be kept in the Democratic side, or can they be brought back over to the Republican side?
Where do you think the Republican leadership is in all of this? I mean, both in the Senate and Congress, we saw some Republican leaders be very quiet or non-reactive to the incident that occurred earlier this week when the protesters were pushed out so that the president could have his photo up in front of St. John's. But they seem not to want to talk about it. Where are they? What kind of limb are they out on?
I think the silence is quite loud in the sense that I think they are attempting to see where the movement goes. I mean, perhaps one reading is not so much from those officials themselves, but I think from what we've seen now from the former military people, like former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, in his quite scathing critique of that event, where he basically says, in effect, that the Trump administration is using the military in an unconstitutional fashion. And moreover, we see the President's Secretary of Defense, Esper, really retreating from his previous rhetoric, talking about the battle space, and now saying he opposes Trump's thinking about using the Insurrection Act to put down the protest. So I think those particular tensions within the military itself, within the Pentagon itself, I would suspect are going to be heard by many of the Republican leadership, because they're still betting that Trump can win re-election, and with Trump's winning re-election, they can retain political power, particularly in the Senate.
Well, one of the things that struck me, you talked a moment ago about sort of trying to use the Nixon playbook of 1968. One of the striking stats I ran across was that in 1968, whites made up about 89.7% of the electorate. In 2020, it is now 66.7%. And it does seem as if the demographic basis for the Republican Party is beginning to slip away, if indeed they are relying on white voters.
I think that contrast is dramatic. And the additional issue that I would add of course, is that, and this is not a new observation, but some observers have said that the Democratic constituency, the Democratic base in 1968 was fragmented. And whereas today, I think it's a fair surmise to suggest that it's much more united, and there's clearly mobilization here that has taken place. So, and it's pretty clear again that Trump and the Trump strategy remains to divide, to try to rally, mobilize white voters. But as you're noting, that may be insufficient this time around.
Now, of course, in 1968, we saw certainly a lot of violence in an era that had far more than just simply civil rights. It, of course, had the Vietnam War with the anti-war protesters and a whole slew of other emerging movements, the women's movement, LGBTQ movement, for example. But one of the things about 1968, it was marked by a great deal of violence across the country, far more than certainly we've seen so far this time around. What do you make of the violence this time, and will it have a similar impact that perhaps it might have had in 1968?
The violence is sporadic, and the instigators are varied. So you have the normal problem of certain elements taking advantage of a situation to loot, but you also have certainly some politically motivated groups to try to cause some violence and to undermine the legitimacy of the protest movement. But I think it's unquestionable that the overwhelming majority of what we've seen in terms of the demonstrations is that they have been peaceful, and that they are mobilized for the issue of social justice and racial justice.
Finally, as a political scientist, one of the interesting issues that's come up is this idea of the president deciding that he wants to, say, send the military out to police the streets of the United States and its the U.S. cities, which there's a lot of pushback on that, just constitutionally speaking. What's the sense about that? In terms of, is that a major break thing with what has been traditionally constitutional law?
Unquestionably. It's been a long-standing law and practice of the military as being used for foreign affairs, for foreign missions, having no role, no significant role at all playing with regard to civil unrest. And that the problem, and here's where federalism comes into play, that it's up to the governors of the states, in conjunction with, of course, the mayors of the cities and jurisdictions below them, to police, to retain order, law and order within their states. And only if the governors believe and conclude they have insufficient resources can they call upon the National Guard and therefore call in reinforcements, in effect. And I think that's why I think Mattis is articulating in his critique of the Trump effort here, is articulating a long-standing position of the military. And I think that's why he's getting a lot of accolades and support, not only from former military people, but I suspect a lot of people within the military who really don't want to have anything to do with this, but also the previous presidents, as we've seen as well.
We've been speaking with Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin on the politics of the protests and the case of George Floyd. Earlier, we had Amber Green. She's co-chair of Salisbury's Lynching Memorial Task Force and a local activist. And Michael, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Thank you, Don. Have a good morning.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.